So this is a fairly short chapter, I think, that you're going to find. It is on the takings clause. So, today what we're going to learn is kind of what is a taking. Because certain things are easier than others. So here's my little list of the major cases that we have here. I have a picture of the former president there because, eminent domain, it's something that he's a big fan of. Kind of a little bit different than a lot of other folks in his party. So today what we're going to do, what is a taking? We have several cases that we're going to go through here today, including one that is what I call a supplementary case. You'll have those throughout the semester. Ones that have been decided since the book was published. So the book was published fairly recently, but sometimes they don't get them all in there. So what I do is I put a summary from SCOTUS blog for you to read, so you don't have to read the whole thing, because some of these are very long. I don't know if you want to read a 50-page opinion. Go to law school, you get to do that. You become a lawyer, you're going to get to do it a lot. So, the takings clause. So, here's the relevant language from it, from the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So, that includes a lot of things. So, basically 3 questions. What is a taking? What is a public use? And what's just compensation? So the most common legal issue that comes out of this is the last one. What is the just compensation? But that's not the matter of a lot of constitutional law, because it's more of a question of fact. So that's the last thing that we cover in the semester. But just kind of think about it like this. Let's say when you're wanting to buy a house or a car, if you've had the ability to do that. What you often notice is that the person wanting to buy thinks that it's probably worth less than the person wanting to sell. So that becomes an issue. So, and then, eminent domain. Because the way most of this stuff works is that it never does go to court. And the reason that it doesn't is that the parties usually come to some agreement. So let's say, if the government's going to build a road, if they knock down your house, that's one thing. But, a lot of times, a lot of these things are not involving necessarily taking of homes. There's sometimes the taking of land. So, often what would happen is that you would have an appraisal done by some neutral party, and they would say what the fair market value is for the property. And then you would usually go with that. So one purpose is to protect the property owner, of course, from the government taking their property. But another purpose, of course, is that it provides protection for the government as well. Because if you didn't have where the government could take for a public use, you could have, let's say, one person, hold up a lot of progress. So, let's say you want to demolish several homes to build a new airport in an area. If you have just a few holdouts or people that are maybe trying to extort the government, or saying, I'll just hold out. You say that this is worth $150,000. I think it's worth $1.5 million. You want to give the government some protection from people like that. So, there are a lot of things that get put in here into the U.S. Constitution. You have to remember is that our current Constitution is not our first Constitution. Well, it was the Articles of Confederation. So the country had been independent for a while. So both had declared independence and formally independent. So a lot of states had written their own constitutions. So when they were states, or even before that. So what you would had were some states had provisions in their state constitutions to deal with this type of thing. Some of them were more favorable to the government. Some of them were more favorable to individual landholders. So you had provisions in places like Massachusetts, South Carolina, Virginia, and in other places. So you have to remember the country was pretty underdeveloped back then. One of the things is that, a lot of roads were private toll roads. Some of them were plank roads. So, if the country's going to expand, you do have to have more roads. So the thing is, initially this part of the Fifth Amendment did not apply to states. If states had their own provisions, well, that's great. But some didn't. So, city or county governments or state government could take property potentially without any compensation. So Barron versus Baltimore, this is the case that I think you should remember reading in more detail at the beginning of the semester, talking about the issue of incorporation. So there was a harbor improvement that made the property less valuable, and the court, in a decision written by Justice Marshall, had said that no, this provision of the Fifth Amendment does not apply to states. Kind of the thinking of the court was that, if the founders wanted to have these provisions used against state and local governments, they would have said it. They would have said it in the U.S. Constitution. They would have said these things apply to the federal government and state and local governments, but they didn't. But the court makes a reversal near the end of the 19th century in Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad versus Chicago. So the court uses the 14th Amendment to apply this to state and local governments in a 7-1 decision by Justice Harlan. They don't use the word incorporation. They use the words of the Due Process Clause. So what the court says here, the conclusion of this court on the question is that the adoption of the 14th Amendment compensation for property taken for public use constitutes an essential element in due process of law, and without such compensation, the appropriation of private property to public uses, no matter under what form or procedure, violates the federal Constitution. No. Means that it applies. And again, there's still going to be haggling because let's say the government tries to lowball you. They might try to do that. I don't think anybody would ever think that the government would try to screw people. Those are one of those ones I wish I was in person so I could see people's faces, see people's reactions without the masks on. So we have to kind of go through the major questions here. So today what our question is what is a taking? Most of these are fairly simple things. So the government acquires your property. So a taking's not necessarily if they can arrange a voluntary sale. So probably what would happen, let's say if they want to build a road, or maybe they're going to widen a road and or maybe they're going to build a sidewalk, maybe something, and they take a little bit of your property. So most likely what would happen is that there would be somebody, some agent of the county or the city or somebody else probably going to send you a letter, tell you what's going on, say, we want, 20 feet of your property here because we're going to put in a sidewalk. We need this in an easement. And it'll probably say, we have had an appraiser come through here and says that the fair market value for this is X number of dollars. Please call the city attorney's office or the county attorney's office if you have any questions. Kind of going through that. And, if you're willing to do this, we'll set up a time, or they might even have a document in there, sign this and, we'll send you a check. Now, a lot of things are more easy to answer. So if the government just literally takes your property, takes it. We're taking. That's where we start calling taking. Let's say if we're going to build an airport. I mean, just think about it. Whenever the Constitution was written, were there airports? No, because the only things that were flying then were birds. Maybe that thing that Da Vinci had flew, but there was no need for an airport. And of course, the thing is, as places grow, there's the need for different services. There's the need for roads. We used, for instance, eminent domain was used to build a lot of our interstates. Now we're looking at some of the consequences of some of those things because, one of the things that some of our interstates and expressways and freeways did was they cut through poor and minority neighborhoods. And, one of the things that led to, dividing communities, pollution, traffic, a lot of problems, for the, purpose of the way that these interstates kind of, they have them where they go around cities, they go through cities, but a lot of kind of the intraday traffic is funneling people from the suburbs where they live to the city where they work. So another example would be, let's say, something that the government started doing a lot of, last century, and that was dam building. Now, some places, out west, there weren't a lot of people because a lot of these areas were, not that populated. But, let's say if you've ever seen the movie Deliverance, which is a rather disturbing movie. But, one of the reasons why they were what they wanted to do those rapids there that they were on the whitewater rafting trip is that they were going to build a dam and the area was going to flood through. So, it would be their last chance to do so. Well, it was a couple of their last chances if you've ever seen it. But, whenever you build a dam, you need water in the back of it to feed, because you're building a dam for different reasons. You may be building it for flood control, but in a lot of cases you're doing it for hydroelectric power. You might be doing it for a water supply too. So there's a lot of different things that you have, but you're going to create a big lake behind it. So a lot of people like these lakes because they provide a lot of recreation today. But, where this lake was, there might have been people. There might have been people's houses. There might have been farmland. So, when, you could probably try to make the argument, okay, well, no, you still have your land. It's just underwater. Well, that would be a taking too. Now, the more physical invasion of the land, the more likely it is to be a taking. So it doesn't have to be a total loss of all property. So we get into some things that we call more regulatory takings that become much more controversial. So one of the things that it turns out that happens is that things with the takings clause become a big thing among conservatives, that they really are more concerned about things that the government is doing, especially with a lot of environmental regulations and things that deprive people of some of the use of their land. Now, not all things that deprive you of some use of your land is necessarily a taking. So zoning, per se, is not a complete taking. So, they recognize, the courts have recognized, you can put some limits on what people can do with their property. But when it goes too far, so in Loretto versus Teleprompter Manhattan CATV Corporation in 1982, there's a New York law that required landlords to allow cable television equipment on the property. Basically required them to do that. There was a good reason. They wanted people in New York to have cable. In a 6-3 decision, Justice Marshall said that this was a taking. One of, Justice Marshall didn't get a lot of notable majority opinions, but this was one of them. One where he was on board more with the conservatives, interesting enough, because you can see the vote line up there, Justice Blackmun, joined by Justice Brennan White, dissenting. Now, landmark case that we get is sometimes known as the chicken versus the bomber case. So, during World War II, a lot of airports needed to be built. Now, if I take your property to build the runway, there is no question that is a taking. Now, I live about 2 miles from the airport. Whenever I'm out taking a walk, I often see the planes. Sometimes I notice sometimes they're flying a little bit low. If I have the windows, I'm kind of like, planes are flying a little bit low today. Now, one thing is about airplanes is that they are kind of noisy. They go really, really fast, and they have big engines that are quite noisy because they have to spin really fast. Because one of the things that with a plane that you don't want to happen is if those engines quit spinning, the plane crashes. And, we have had a plane crash in the Buffalo area. It was actually the last commercial plane crash in America. But how close do you want to live to the airport? Or an Army Air Corps base? So they own land very close to where it was. So the end of the runway was very close to their property and flew just a few feet above it. So that's one of the things is, if you live close to the airport, I live in Williamsville. I think we know where the airport is. It's just across from the Amherst line in Cheektowaga. Probably if you've went down Young's Road, you cross the thruway and you see entering the town of Cheektowaga, and then you're there. You might go underneath that little tunnel if you kind of go that way, or you might go on the main road if you live other places. But how close do you want to be to a bunch of airplanes landing? Now, if you buy there, that's one thing. Whenever something changes, it's a little bit different. So they raised chickens. Many of their chickens died and didn't lay as many eggs. So, my grandparents raised chickens. I actually remember, getting eggs. They were chickens for eggs. When I was a small child, one of the good things was I wasn't very big, so I could easily get inside the chicken house. One of the things it turns out that chickens, I guess, don't like is to live next to an airport. And they didn't live near an airport. They lived out in the country. So, as you could probably guess, this was in the Greensboro area. This is before Greensboro was very big. Greensboro, North Carolina. They're in the Piedmont Triad, as we know it today. They were kind of like, well, whenever we had our farm here, there was planes landing all the time. So what happened is that they couldn't use their land to raise chickens anymore. And that was their living. So they sued and win a judgment because they said it was a taking. So the federal appeals court said, the federal government appeals saying, no, there's no taking. So the question is, did this amount to a taking? Thus, it violates the Takings Clause, violates the 5th and 14th Amendments. Or actually, it would just violate the 5th Amendment, because you actually would be suing the federal government. So the federal government says there was no physical invasion of the land because this was just airspace. So they're saying, you know what? I mean, we never came on their property. We just flew over it. I mean, that's one of those things you have to start thinking, well, in 1787, they wrote this thing. How much could they have conceived that we had, these giant flying things? I mean, they couldn't even. I mean, this was before, you had, a lot of things. Before you had an automobile, let alone a airplane or internal combustion engine, even a balloon. So they said the damage is negligible. So the federal law gives the government power over the airspace of the country. So the Cosbys say, no. It was a taking given that it damaged the productivity of the property because of the location of the airport. They destroyed their chicken business. It's not like that they were going to particularly get a lot out of this. But the government, I think, looked at it as, we don't want to have, we don't want to have this as a precedent. So the 5-2 decision by Justice Douglas, he was joined by Justices Frankfurter, Murphy, Reed, and Rutledge. Justice Jackson did not participate in the case, I believe because he had been the Attorney General a little bit before this. Wait a second. I think Justice Jackson didn't participate because he was at Nuremberg. I always have to remember that, because he was both Attorney General and Nuremberg prosecutor. Took a little leave from the Supreme Court. So they said, no, don't follow this common law doctrine. It's ancient, extended everywhere. It has no place in the modern world. The airspace is a public highway. So they're not going to count everything above and below. So, the fact that an airplane flies where, like where I live, I can tell what airline it is. I mean, it's that low. But I mean, it doesn't usually bother me too much. So it says to use common sense. When you fly really, really, really low, when you interrupt the enjoyment of your property, it may be a little bit different. So he's one of the other things that he says is that, it may be different based on the different type of property. So if you're flying over a factory, it's probably, or let's say, what he says, an orchard or a vegetable patch, it probably doesn't bother those that much. So it might be different if it's more residential property. But this here, it was that they're flying really, really low, and it was really, really close. So the proximity here is that the land is not being able to be used for what it was before. And it led to a direct and immediate interference with the enjoyment of the use of land. So, according to Justice Douglas and the court's majority here, they have to be compensated for their loss. Now, you have a dissent here from Justice Black. So, one of the things to remember about Justice Black is that he is somebody that really, really prides himself on being a textualist as far as the Constitution. So he's basically saying they didn't take anything. He didn't see that there's a taking. This goes too far in considering what necessarily is a taking. So, he's saying, well, is it a taking if there's noisy vehicles that go down the street next to where you live? So Justice Black here saying, I am not willing I'm not willing, nor do I think the Constitution and these decisions authorize me to extend that phrase as to guarantee an absolute constitutional right to relief not subject to legislative change, which is based on averments that at best show mere torts committed by the government agents while flying over the land. The future adjustment of the rights and remedies of the property owners might be found necessarily because of the flight of planes at safe altitude should, especially in views of the imminent expansion of air navigation, be left where I think the Constitution left, Congress. So Justice Black here is saying that, why don't we let Congress determine this? We'll let Congress determine this. So again, this was sometimes known as the chicken versus the bomber. I love the picture of the very concerned chicken with the airplane flying over. So the question kind of coming about from this you get is, exactly how far is this going to go? With what if the government says that you can't do certain things with your land? You can't make it more valuable. Now again, can't make it more valuable versus making it less valuable, I think is a kind of a key distinction. So in Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahone, 1922, the court had said, a general rule, at least, while property may be regulated to a certain extent, if the regulation goes too far, it will be recognized as a taking. So, if you regulate property too much, it can become a taking. Now, some people maybe don't want any regulation. I think we always have to recognize that. But, in other instances, certain things may be necessary as far as some regulations. So what if you just can't use it in ways that you would like to? I mean, that's a good question. So what if it would be bad for the neighborhood if you did something? So, maybe you don't want, let's say, maybe you don't want a fertilizer plant next to a house. But, maybe a fertilizer company bought the land, like, I want to build a fertilizer company. It's a question. So our next case comes out of New York City. Penn Central Transportation Company versus the City of New York in 1978, the year of my birth. So the New York City Landmark Preservation Act of 1965 protected historic buildings and such. So, there's an idea that, we want to protect certain historic buildings. We don't just want to knock down all the old stuff and put up new. So there are similar laws in every state. Many cities and towns do this because, they want to protect historic buildings. Because the thing is, sometimes historic buildings bring in tourists. Well, that's one reason. But, some people just like things to be preserved for historical purposes. So if they were designated, the owners could keep the building in certain conditions and couldn't alter the buildings without prior authorization. So, some places they want the buildings to kind of stay kind of similar-ish to kind of how they looked, to kind of give people an idea maybe how something, used to look. Now, the owners got no compensation for this, but they could get tax breaks on other properties. Kind of an interesting way of kind of trying to get around that. So the owners, what they wanted to do there is to build a large new building above the station and make alterations to the exterior. So they said it amounted to taking. The New York court said it wasn't. So the question is, guess what? Is it a taking under the 5th, 14th Amendments? So Justice Brennan for a 6-3 majority, and he was joined by Justices Blackmun, Marshall, Powell, Stewart, and White, said that it was not a taking. So this is looking at the extent of where regulatory takings go. So kind of the idea is that if you make regulations to be a taking, or you make them not to be a taking, because they may cost a lot. One of the ideas is that if you consider them a taking, and it's going to cost government a lot more money to do them, you'll probably get less regulations, and vice versa. So it'll depend, Justice Brennan says, is on the facts and the particular circumstances. So you have to look at things, for instance, the economic impact of the regulation, the extent which the regulations interfered with the investment, and the character of the government action. So, is it a physical invasion? Is a big question. So things where we think things are a physical invasion, the court is really kind of considering them a taking. But on the other hand, is it something done to promote the public good? Now, I think we have to remember here that in these cases that we're going to talk about today versus what we're going to talk about next time, the ones today, the key thing is that everybody's accepting in these cases that it is a public use. The question is it a taking, and does the government have to pay the people for it? So takings challenges have not moved into zoning ordinances, as mentioned. So in the case that I mentioned in Mahone, the court found that a law that prohibited mining underneath surface level buildings was a taking because it closed the mine. So that's what Justice Brennan says was the reason that it did so. So if you were to look on page 628, this is what was supposed to be there at Grand Central Terminal. So the thing is, they actually have redone Grand Central Terminal, if you've been there. Well, not even recently. I've done it for a little while ago. Very beautiful inside. But, you'd have this big thing there. So, the thing you have to remember about Manhattan is that unless you want to fill in part of the East River or the Hudson River, the only way you're getting more space is to go up. Unless you want to destroy Central Park, which I don't think they want to do. So the court does not see that this is a taking. They can still get a reasonable return on their investment. They can still sell the property. But what they can't do is to maximize their profit. So they can't use it to make even more money. So what they're saying here is that, you can do all right. It's just you're not going to do even better. So they're related to the general welfare. So what they're saying here is you can use the property the same as you have for the last 65 years. You just can't do anything different with it necessarily. Now, in a dissent by Justice Rehnquist, remember he started as Justice Rehnquist and then became Chief Justice, and joined by Chief Justice Berger and Justice Stevens. So what he says is that it imposed severe costs on the company. So one of the things that, Justice Rehnquist clearly is, right on, for instance, is that, the idea of air rights. The idea that in Manhattan and in a lot of large cities where, there's just not a lot of space. I mean, like I said, the thing about Manhattan is an island. You can get a lot more of it. When they built the World Trade Center, they actually used some of the dirt that they excavated actually to make the island a little bit bigger. But, how much more of that do you want to do? I mean, if you start adding more land around places, aren't you going to raise the sea level a little bit? I think if you just do it on a small scale, it probably has a negative effect globally, but you never know. What he says is that this potentially millions of dollars in revenue that the company could have they can't get now. So they said, if you want to have this, you can have it. But the burden on this should be for everybody in the city. So if everybody in the city wants this ordinance on, historic preservation, they should pay for it. They should compensate the people that are losing their rights here. One of the things that he also mentions a little bit here is that the city of New York, this was about the time that they almost had to declare bankruptcy. The city was literally on the verge of financial collapse. One of the things that he also says is that the cost of preserving this would be, what he says, cents per year to people. I was going to say pennies for persons. That would actually be more alliterative. I bet Justice Scalia would have written pennies per persons. But he said it's going to cost the company millions of dollars, and it would just cost just a few cents for people. Now, Justice Brennan's opinion seemed to be the accepted view on what we call regulatory takings. But are we going to have the winds of change? So there are a number of themes that I always have in my constitutional law classes. But in this one, as you're going to see in the next chapter a lot, that I want to really get across to people is this. Court composition matters. The law can change because the justices change. I know with the issue of stare decisis that shouldn't be the case, but it is. We're going to see that in the next case in the next chapter in the Dobbs case. Literally, the law on abortion changed because members of the court changed. And with the issues in the takings clause, that becomes the key as well. So here's a quote from Michael Kinsley, former host of Crossfire, which used to be a show on CNN before most of you probably watched TV. The takings clause of the Fifth Amendment for conservatives is what the equal protection clause of the 14th is for liberals. So just kind of Michael Kinsley pointing out how important it had become to conservatives. So government land use regulation had become more aggressive. And we're going to get the Rehnquist Court. So Chief Justice Burger retires. So this is a twofer that Ronald Reagan does. In this twofer, William Rehnquist becomes the Chief Justice and Antonin Scalia becomes the new Associate Justice. So the fact is, this doesn't move the court that much more to the right. But it gives somebody that's kind of a champion of the holding that things were takings to become the Chief Justice. And maybe you're going to get some other folks on board. So remember, you also had Sandra Day O'Connor that was added to the court, replacing Justice Pell. Now, in 1987, you had some cases where people were kind of like, wonder what the court's up to. Maybe are they kind of, do they kind of have something other up their sleeve? So in the Keystone Bituminous Coal Association versus De Benedictus, there was a 5-4 majority that upheld a coal mining regulation. So, but the thing is that the dissenting opinion of Chief Justice Rehnquist got a total of 4 votes, including his own. Then you had another case that was decided that year. So you had 3 cases on this. the First English Evangelical Lutheran Church of Glendale versus the County of Los Angeles. It's a mouthful. A 6-3 court found a regulation that prohibited the reconstruction of building land that was previously flooding was a taking. So the owners has to be compensated, or the ordinance had to be amended. So Rehnquist wrote the majority opinion with Justice Stevens in dissent. So one of the things that Justice Stevens says in his dissent is that this is going to generate more litigation, because you'd had a whole conservative legal movement that was out there that was waiting to file different lawsuits on behalf of property owners. So the big case. So this was one of the big cases in 1987 released near the end of the term, was a really good indication of where the Rehnquist court was going on these cases. So the idea of property rights was becoming a big issue on the conservative side. So the Nolans owned a small beachfront lot with a bungalow they rented. So you can see there's a picture of it at the time, along the coast. So there is there's a highway. There's some other things. I found this on the internet. You can see that it looks like it needs a little bit of work. So it fell into disrepair and couldn't be rented. So they applied for a permit to replace it. So they granted it, but the provision was that a small part was to be used for the public to move between the beaches, aka an easement. So a lot of you might know about easements. Some of you might have easements. So my family owned a little small farm, and it was kind of near the road, and there were a couple families that lived behind us. So there was a private road that we had. It was just a gravel road. It was privately maintained. It wasn't any public. So, both of those families in the back had an easement to come through, that road that we had. We kind of had an informal agreement about, that part, with, rock grading and things. Because if you have a gravel road, maybe a lot of you aren't familiar with gravel roads, but, eventually you need to add more rock at some point. So, one of the reasons that I put this on here is that, an easement for the public to come through, those are pretty close together. So, it's not like, you have a several acre lot and, somebody's going to be way over there. You can kind of see that, there might be some people looking through your window. A lot of people might not want somebody looking through their window. Not that people are doing anything particularly that bad, but you never know. You might have your drapes open a little bit, and you're trying to get dressed or something, and there's somebody just walking next to your window. People often want to have their window open, or there's shades and things, and you're kind of like, maybe I don't want that. Of course, the other thing is some people are really messy people. They might drop trash there. So it was justified by seawall. So this was the argument. That it would reduce the lack of beach viewing by the new house. So, you can see here, kind of those arrows on the other sides are kind of where you had more access to the beach. So, and that's one of the things about, beaches along, oceans and things. How much should beaches be public versus private? Because let's think about this. As far as a property right, an important thing about a property right is that means that if it's yours, one of the things that some of you have probably seen sometimes in your life, maybe not directly related aimed at you necessarily personally, but you may see a sign that says no trespassing. Just think about that. No trespassing. That means if I don't give you permission to come onto my property, you don't get to come onto my property. So Nolan said this was a taking. They lose in the California courts. So the question is, does this amount to a taking under the 15th, 14th Amendments? So for the Nolans, so here's a little bit different view of it. Some beaches are better than others. So, we all can't have a beach like, the lovely beaches in Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic, or in Cancun, or let's say in Destin or Clearwater Beach, Florida, or Hilton Head Island. Just mention some. Some are not that nice. So, some have a lot of rocks. Some really don't necessarily have the sand on there. Some of it may be kind of swampy. So they said that this would lead to a physical invasion of the property by the public. So it would clearly be a taking. So they got, there are certain people that may have gotten benefit of it, but we didn't get benefit of it. All we want to do is we have this very valuable property in California along the beach, and we have a property that is sitting here. We can't really use it. It's in bad shape. We want to improve it, and you won't let us unless you let people are going to be coming through our property. So the Coastal Commission said it serves an important public interest in beach access expansion. So that's the thing that you have to sometimes think about beaches. Well, the beach may not be public. While the beach may be public, getting to it, let's say from the road or where you're going to park, may not be. So, you may have access to, you may be able to walk down along a lot of that beach, but you have to find a way to get there. So they said they lost no economic value, and they have not confiscated or taken the land. So this was a 5-4 decision by Justice Antonin Scalia. And where it kind of set up was he was joined by Justices O'Connor, Powell, Rehnquist, and White. So a little bit more of an ideological vote. You had where the dissenting justice. Well, let's save the dissent for later. So Scalia says that if you would have done this under eminent domain, rather than as a condition of the building permit, it would have been considered a taking. So essentially what this does, it is an easement that amounts to giving people the ability to physically invade the property. So he says that there are certain things that, let's say, they could have done. Maybe a height limitation, restriction or ban on fences. Could be done. But this goes a little bit further. This goes too far. You're actually going to have people that are going to be on there. So kind of going back to the Loretto case, they have to physically invade the property to get there. So he finds that this is for a legitimate public purpose, but it lacks the nexus to the condition of the permit. So therefore, what he's saying, the government can do this. So he's not saying that this is not a public use. He's saying it's a taking, meaning that the Nolans have to be compensated. So, gotta keep that. So the one thing is, they can keep doing this stuff, but they have to compensate them. They can't just do it without. So just to let you know that there are separate dissents from Justices Blackmun and Stevens that are not printed in the book. So it's a 5-4 decision, but the Brennan Marshall dissent. So he sees this as an imposition and imposing a condition on private development. So he said the denial of the permit would have still left it economically viable. But the reason for the condition is that they were going to build a larger structure and it reduced visual access to the beach, and so this was an offset to that. Now, the one thing that Justice Brennan, so some of the more liberal justices, as you're starting to enter the Rehnquist era, with the court becoming more conservative, they get kind of where they're starting to see where, they aren't going to be around that much longer because of their ages, that they're starting to think, what's going on here? So he says he hopes the case is not an aberration and not as what's going to happen next. So, that's kind of what we're seeing there from, Justice Brennan. Let me just take that back. Wait a second. I'm sorry. It's flipping to the wrong page for some reason. I thought that I'd printed something wrong. I hadn't. I was actually looking at the Lucas case while I was talking about this one. So we're all good. So I thought that they had printed some other dissents, and I'm kind of like, oh, did I miss those? I thought I was losing it. I'm not. Well, I may be, but for other reasons. So more changes. So the court gets even more conservative as you add Thomas and Kennedy to the court. The wind's also shifting more on environmental regulations on the right. So you can see there's Justice Kennedy and President Reagan. So Lucas versus the South Carolina Coastal Commission. So this is a case that attracts a lot of attention. So this is one where, you have a lot of conservative outside groups get involved here. So the Pacific Legal Foundation, a big conservative group involved in property rights. The George H.W. Bush administration, a lot of other interest groups like home builders, miners, Farm Bureau. But you have a lot of local government organizations, environmentalists, and historic preservationists that were on the other side of the issue. So here what you have is the Isle of Palms in South Carolina. So South Carolina is a place that has a lot of beautiful beaches. It's a state that's seen a lot of growth in the coastal areas of its state. You have a lot of beautiful beaches around Charleston, Hilton Head, Myrtle Beach. So he was going to build a single-family home like the ones in this area. So when he bought them, he was like, he'd be able to do so. What he wanted to do was build some single-family homes. So South Carolina passes the Beach Management Act of 1988. So South Carolina, like a lot of other coastal states, is concerned about coastal erosion. So that's one of the things that we have to consider with climate change. Is the sea level rises, it's going to mean that some of the beaches are either going to disappear or they're going to move further back. The thing is, since beachfront property is quite valuable, where the beaches might move might be where there's a house, or some condos, or some hotels. So they wanted to balance development with conservation. So the plan to build these homes was denied. So he acknowledged the public purpose, but he wanted compensation. So he wins a trial with South Carolina Supreme Court versus. So big case. Big case in 1992. Though at the time it was probably overshadowed a little bit by Casey. So the question here is, did this deprive him of some of his rights under the 5th and 14th Amendments? Now, so there's the South Carolina, part of the South Carolina flag imposed on the map of South Carolina. So that's a palmetto tree. It actually produces, there's actually a food that comes out of it. It's the palmetto. Some people down there, they call it swamp cabbage. I think it has a different name that commonly goes by. But so for Lucas, they said, okay, we acknowledge that this is a valid use of police power and that the government can do this. They just have to compensate us. So they said, okay, we acknowledge there's a nuisance exception to this, but home building isn't a nuisance. So it makes this economically worthless, so it amounts to a taking. So the burden of this should fall on everybody in South Carolina through the takings clause, not just the property owners. So here's another kind of view of Isle of Palms. So you can see that bridge there that you go across. So these regulations could have been reasonably anticipated. There have been previous pieces of legislation when you bought it. So it's a health and safety regulation. It's not worthless. It just can't be used for the most profitable use. So this is kind of going off the Penn Station case, if you will, where they said, you still use it. It's just you can't make the most money off of it. Now, Justice Scalia for 63 Court points to the Mahone case and says that made those companies' mines worthless. So, two ways regulations have to be compensated. If you have a physical invasion of the property, or if it denies all economically beneficial or productive use, even for the common good. So what Scalia is saying here is that you're essentially transforming, if you're not compensating people, you are transforming private property into public property. So, that's kind of where he's saying here. So remember, Justice Scalia is not saying that government can't do this. They're just saying that you have to compensate for it. So noxious or harmful argument is not enough to sustain this. This is not a nuisance but a productive use. And other landowners that are still doing this, they get to keep doing it. It's not like that this is just a virgin beach. There are a lot of other homes. So he kind of comes up with, if you will, talking about a total taking inquiry. So we have a couple of dissents here. One from Justice Blackmun, where he says the court launches a moose to kill a mosquito, or launches a missile to kill a moose, and the court shouldn't even take in this case. It's a broad ruling on a narrow case, and they've taken the takings clause jurisprudence way too far. The land was not completely worthless. The owner could still do multiple things. They just can't build houses on it. So, Justice Stevens here is also not very happy. So the impact of the ban on developmental uses must also be viewed in light of the purpose of the act. The legislature stated that the purpose of the act as protecting, preserving, restoring, and enhancing the beach dune system of the state, not only for recreational ecological purposes, but also to protect life and property. The state, with much science on its side, believes that the beach dune system is a buffer from high tide, storm surge, and hurricanes. Traditional important exercise. So I think what Justice Stevens here is saying, this is for the benefit of everybody. So he kind of goes a little bit further, saying, even assuming the argument that it's rendered valueless, that we have to look at the compelling purpose of what South Carolina was doing here. So the state ends up, after this, Lucas gets $1.5 million. The state sells it, and later an owner builds a large house on it. So, you can see the new house that was built on page 637. So the state actually did that, sold the land off to recoup the money. So the next case that we have is one that often a lot of people are kind of flummoxed about. Not because of the case, but because I think people realize that people were kind of like, really? There's a raisin reserve? there really is a raisin reserve out there. Yes, there is. I mean, before this case, I didn't realize that. I kind of like raisins. I mean, they're the court kind of goes out of its way to say how they like raisins. But the Agricultural Management Act of 1937 gives the Secretary of Agriculture powers to maintain certain stable markets of products. So, I mean, this is kind of one of the big things that you have in a lot of agriculture is that, what we have sometimes is the government sometimes pays farmers not to plant things because what they want is a stable market. They want where everybody's going to get a decent price. So sometimes that means that, we don't want an oversupply. So you end up creating this raisin reserve. The farmers had to give part of their raisin crop to the federal government. So they would do things such as donate, sell, dispose of them. Any profits would go back to the farmers, though. So it's not like they were going to actually be necessarily out that much. So the farmers could sell all the other ones not going into the raisin reserve. So, I like raisins. I get my little, that's one of those things I don't know if you all necessarily had as a kid. Sometimes, you have those tiny little boxes of raisins that, you might get in your lunchbox when you're in elementary school. I mean, it's a nice little treat. I mean, they're nice. I mean, just little dried up grapes. So the Horns refused to sell any of their raisins and were fined the value of the missing raisins, and it was a civil penalty. They lose at the Ninth Circuit and the district court level. So the court has to look at three questions. So does the takings clause only apply to real property? So if you're wondering what I'm talking about real property, there are two types of property. If you go to law school, you will learn this in a class called property law. So real property, that's something that's kind of attached to the ground. So that's your house, a shed, a barn, or different things. Personal property are things that aren't necessarily tied down. So, your car, your boat, your food. So, can the government avoid compensation payments by reserving the value contingently? So, and then, does a taking occur when the government mandates the relinquishment of specific identifiable property as a condition to engage in commerce? So, I remember this back when I was a kid during the 1980s. In order to promote the raisin industry in America, I believe I don't know if it was the California Department of Agriculture or someone, they literally had these little animated characters called the California Raisins. And they sang. They actually had little plastic figures that came. I actually remember getting some. I actually remember when this came on, it was a big thing. So for Horn, he looks so mad in that picture. He kind of reminds me a little bit of Broderick Crawford, kind of looking at him there. So they say a taking occurs when the government takes possession of their property. The marketing order works as a taking, and compensation is required for real and personal property. So for the Department of Agriculture, what they say is that the marketing order keeps the farmers interested in the raisins. They voluntarily choose the commercial raisin market over other markets. So what the Department of Agriculture here is saying is that, you know what, you can raise a lot of different things. You chose to raise raisins. Remember, grapes. So you're not using them for wine. You're using them for raisins. So any loss is compensated through the increased value of the raisins. So it was kind of a mostly 5-4 court here. So Justice Breyer, Ginsburg, and Kagan say that there was they said that a taking occurred, but they didn't want to remand the case back to the Court of Appeals to determine the compensation. So kind of a halfway measure. Seems like I forgot to put a picture of John Roberts eating raisins here. Maybe I didn't have one. Someday if I meet John Roberts, I will maybe I'll have some raisins and I can hand them to him, and maybe we can get a picture with the raisins. So compensation is required for all property taken under the Fifth Amendment, not just real property. There's no reason to separate types of property. This is a taking by putting it into the reserve program. So just because you put it in, have a contingent interest, doesn't make it where the government doesn't owe compensation. The interest is not enough. So he says that it works as it's not a voluntary scheme. He also talks about how raisins are a healthy snack. They're not a pesticide. So one of the things that you have here is that it seems that there's a talk of between the parties, between the dissent and the majority, about this raisin program. So they ordered the compensation of the market value of the raisins and rescind the civil penalty. So I think I might have told you that wrong. So what they said is that they would have remanded it back on the issue of damages. So the court here basically just says, you get all the money. So, the one thing is that Roberts kind of goes through here and talks about, they're taking a lot of his raisins. A lot of raisins. I bet some of you probably are going to, after you read this case and listen to the lecture, probably thinking, I'm going to go to Wegmans or Tops and get me some raisins. I haven't had raisins in a while. They're a very nutritious snack. Justice Sotomayor completely dissents. Says it's not a taking because it does not deny all the property rights. She also makes the point that this is a healthy snack. So it seems that you have a unanimous agreement between all of the justices that raisins are a good thing, that they are a nice, healthy snack. Probably not if you're on a low-carb diet, because I think they have some carbohydrates because there's sugar and raisins, because remember, they are a grape. It seems like every time I teach this class, whenever I'm either preparing or recording a lecture for it, often I look for raisins because they are kind of tasty. There again, there's Mr. Horn, grouchy old fella there. Again, looks a lot like Broderick Crawford, I think. Old actor. Well, he's dead now. No, I don't know if Mr. Horn's dead, but I know Broderick Crawford is. Hopefully Mr. Horn is still with us. I mean, he doesn't look that young there. Hopefully he's kind of healthy. They say that you live longer if you have more of a positive attitude, but you'd think he'd be more happy since he won, but maybe it was before he won and he didn't think he might win. But Justice Sotomayor also says the program was kind of silly. So your book actually mentions this case, but I think that it deserves a deep dive into looking at it more significantly, because I think that it is important. And, it gives us, I think, in the course, our first opportunity to look at this newly constituted Roberts Court with Barrett on it. So with a 6-3 majority. So there was a 1975 law passed in California that allowed for the farm worker union organizers to enter the property of growers 3 hours a day for over a 30-day period for a total of 120 days a year, basically to try to recruit people into the farm workers union. One thing is that there's a lot of farm workers in California. Not that many are in the union. So 2 California growers filed a lawsuit, so none of the workers lived on the property. So let's take a look here from ABC News, a clip here talking about the Cedar Point Nursery case.
Today, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in what some are calling the sleeping blockbuster case of the year. It's a debate over property rights and labor unions with potentially major implications for health and safety inspections, anti-discrimination laws, and the ability of farm workers to organize. Here's Devin Dwyer.
Cedar Point Nursery in far northern California is the birthplace of baby strawberry plants that feed a multi-billion-dollar fruit industry.
We're one of 7 nurseries that supply the California fruit industry that produces 85% of all fruit consumed nationwide.
Owner Mike Fonner has been in the business for 23 years. Each fall, he hires a small army of migrant workers for a 6 to 8 week sprint to get his product out to customers.
We have to provide them with a good, clean work environment, safe, warm housing, and good pay. We've never had any experience whatsoever with union activity.
In October 2015, the union came to Cedar Point. A group of United Farm Worker activists marched onto the property to organize. Fonner says he was blindsided.
They're chanting on bullhorns, and all work stops. It just literally stops while we're like going, what is this? It's a definition of an ambush, honestly.
Union leaders say it was hardly an ambush.
When we hear words like invasion, attack, those really have racist undertones for people that do not look like the owners coming onto their property. Trespass does not include the lawful activity of union organizers entering onto property for the purpose of speaking with workers under the Agricultural Labor Relations Act.
For 45 years, California state law has authorized union organizers to access farm property for 120 days a year, 3 hours a day during non-work periods. The rules were passed in response to farm worker protests and boycotts in the 1960s and 70s over poor pay and working conditions. Civil rights leader and UFW founder Cesar Chavez argued the right to organize on farm property was essential.
Many agricultural sites are remote. They're in rural areas where access to the internet may be limited. There is no central place for these workers. The work site can be changing from morning into the afternoon, let alone from day to day or from week to week. So when people come onto the work site, that makes them actually believe that these rights actually apply to them, that they can actually use them and they feel empowered to use them.
But Cedar Point Nursery and Fowler Packaging Company, a table grape and citrus producer which also clashed with the union, argue the law is archaic and should be struck down. The businesses sued the state in 2016, alleging that being forced to grant access to union organizers amounts to an illegal taking of their property by the government. The case landing at the U.S. Supreme Court with potential stakes far beyond the nation's farms.
I'm sure many restaurants would say the same thing about food inspectors. They'd say, we want to allow customers in our property. We just don't want to allow food inspectors to check to see if there are rats running around the kitchen. That ultimately is what is at stake here.
The Takings Clause of the U.S. Constitution says private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. It's typically applied to cases of eminent domain, but the farms want the justices to endorse a broader view, one that gives them more power to push back against state regulations.
I think this could be one of the most important cases of the term by far. And what the businesses are arguing here is they have a constitutional right to treat some people on their property different from others.
The stakes are high for the UFW. Despite more than 500,000 farm workers in California, only around 10,000 are union members. The group relies on access to farms to recruit and to educate workers.
I do the harvest of apples, cherries, nectarines, peaches, pears, all of that.
While working conditions and wages have improved over the years, and Fonner says his employees have no complaints, the state of California argues there's still much that needs to be monitored at farms across the industry.
Conditions are very intense. They're very harsh. They're working outdoors. They're still working long hours. There are still issues with adequate access to water, adequate access to shade, adequate access to basic toilet facilities even.
With a phone and a video recorder in every person's pocket. If working conditions are subpar, that that is exposed immediately, and from that phone will go to every platform imaginable: Facebook, Twitter.
The showdown over union access rights in California comes as union membership nationwide is at a record low, a sign of slower job growth in unionized industries and also the declining power of organized labor.
The choice to join a union is up to the workers, full stop.
President Biden last month throwing his support behind Amazon workers in Alabama as they try to become the first unionized Amazon facility in the country. Labor advocates say the Supreme Court's decision in the Cedar Point nursery case could make the right to organize in some places harder to achieve.
It could be a real blow to accountability in a lot of other sectors that do not involve just labor law. There are just not enough laws protecting farm workers' right to organize.
Critics say you're out to attack unions, that you want to kill the unions. Is that what you're out to do?
I don't have a strong opinion on the unions. To communicate with someone effectively, they have the means. They don't need access to our property for that purpose. And we've got to change this law, period.
During oral arguments, many of the Supreme Court justices appeared sympathetic to the farm owners' claims, signaling perhaps the court could move to roll back those union access rights in California. But several justices also suggested a more balanced approach to protecting property rights, saying the right to organize and to access for those health and safety inspections are important as well. A decision in this case is expected by the end of June.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos.
Today, the U.S.
We don't need to listen to George there. The arguments here, so I think you kind of heard some of them there. So for Cedar Point and for the Fowler Packing Company, so there's the picture of the California Solicitor General making his, I believe, Zoom arguments. So the regulation is based on an old model where the workers were cut off from the property, where they lived on the property and they're largely cut off. So the union gets access to everybody here, regardless of whether they live on the property or not. And this essentially creates an easement, taking without proper compensation. And it doesn't matter the time frame that's limited. So CEED, for the California Labor Relations Board, says this is only a narrow obligation on the growers, that very limited times before or after work lunchtime, and that union organizers have used this very sparingly. So unlike prior cases, physical invasion is limited in its duration and is very minimal. So one of the things is that you'll see that I like to do in my classes is Supreme Court rulings start to roll out at about 10 o'clock in the morning is the way it works. And Pete Williams, sadly, is retiring. I'm glad for him that he's retiring. But I really like, he's the chief justice correspondent for NBC News. And he's the one that often will report what some of these decisions are. So let's let Pete tell you what happened on this case. Just to let you know, the person that Pete got his career working for, Dick Cheney. When he was a member of the House, he was his press secretary and then press secretary for the Defense Department. So Pete Williams, just an all-around great guy.
I want to ask, the Supreme Court just issued a new ruling on restricting union access to farm workers. What can you tell us about that?
Right. This case came from California, where union organizers under a California rule had the authority to enter the private property of growers for up to 120 days a year to talk about joining the union by farm workers. And today the Supreme Court said that violates the growers' Fifth Amendment rights against taking. That's what the Constitution says, is you can't take someone's private property without the compensation. And the Supreme Court said in this case, this amounted to a taking. This was a 6-3 ruling written by the Chief Justice John Roberts. The three liberals dissented. They said it's not a taking, it's just a regulation. But it's this whole issue of this, what is a taking when the government asserts some kind of control over private property, is a big deal for conservatives, and the conservatives were pretty well united on this one.
All right, Pete Williams for us in Washington today. Pete, thanks. I want to ask.
So, just to let you know that one of the things that you often see in law, in cases, in arguments, in a lot of things, is the so-called slippery slope argument. That if you do, and it's in politics too. I mean, let's not beat around the bush on that too. That if you do X, if you do A, B, C, D, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, all the way down the alphabet, and then you start AA, whatever you want to do, is going to happen. So that's kind of what the dissent's going to say. But the court here says, when the government physically acquires private property for a public use, the Fifth Amendment's Takings Clause imposes a clear and categorical obligation to provide the owner with just compensation. So, what Chief Justice Roberts here says, and this was a 6-3 ideological decision. You can see there he's at the President Biden's first address to a joint session of Congress there with Bernie Sanders a little bit behind him. That's the one where they were very socially distanced because, we were in the height of COVID and everybody had to wear a mask. So it creates a right to invade the person's land and occupy it for a period of time. Doesn't matter the duration. So the owners have lost their ability to exclude people. So that's something that I had mentioned earlier in the lecture, that the power to own property is the power to exclude other people from coming onto it. So Roberts says this is the most important part of property rights. So without the regulation, the owners could have excluded the owners from property. So this therefore qualifies as a taking. Now, the dissent from the liberals here, led by Justice Breyer. So a regulation that temporarily limits an owner's right to exclude people automatically counts, according to the court's logic. So the court rejects the temporary, the fact that it's temporary imposes a new standard. So he's kind of making this slippery slope argument. So there's when he was on Stephen Colbert, where Justice Breyer, who often was known as the most anonymous justice in his time on the court, it was a long time on the court. It was 28 years, pretty long tenure. But I think he might have liked to have stayed on the court a little bit longer, but I think he didn't want to see. I think he basically saw what happened to his colleague Justice Ginsburg being replaced by Justice Barrett, and didn't want to see that came about. So he's kind of making this slippery slope argument here. It said, if the government wants health and safety inspectors at food packing plants, does that become a physical invasion? Now, I think that the argument for that the majority might make in saying its limitation is that the government may be exercising some legitimate police powers here, and you were giving a private entity, a union, the ability to come in to the property. We're done for today. And next time what we're going to do is that we are going to look at what a public use is, and we're going to look at a few things on what just compensation is. So until then, bye-bye. See y'all later.